that was informative. I'm like, if you go to a stand-up show or any show and you're like, I have to follow that? Oh my God, thank you. Jessica, that was beautiful. Seriously, I was just like, drop the mic, let me go home. So I decided to title this Create, Perform, Life Theater. And the question is, how are we creating the theater of our lives in the sense of how are we working together? What are we creating? And so I'm trained as a cell biologist, but I work bringing cultural approaches to academics in STEM communities as a way of us to grapple with how are we going to create our culture in a way that we want to live in it, whether that's in the institution or out of the institution. So I actually thought I had taken this slide out because I wanted to give you guys a sense of how I've come into academia, how I came into biology, and ultimately what led me to create improv science. But again, with this focus on what is it to create our culture. And our culture, I say, because we are people in the world, we're people in America at this moment, we're in this room at this moment. How do we want to talk to one another? How do we want to learn from one another? What do we want to create? And so I am a former born-again Christian. I love that you were talking about theology. I was like, hey, humanity's in the house. I grew up in Northern California. I am biracial. I come from poor working class backgrounds, although my dad was an academic. He was actually a cultural historian, which I just learned. So it was really interesting. I'm like, what's a cultural historian? Well, at least it's like, well, it's not a scientific historian. And one of his statements was that it takes a look at all of who we are, the moments in history, what our experiences are, to have an understanding of where we've come from so we have a sense of where we're going. So growing up where I did, one of the things is I wanted a way for people to be able to come together in the world, right? Because basically my world was fragmented in 100 different ways. Born in 1968, Martin Luther King was an amazing human being. He was a cultural leader. He was a leader of people that came together from very different backgrounds because they said, hey, we want to do the country in a new way. And from very, very different backgrounds. In fact, people didn't agree on things, but they moved in alliances and allegiances in order to make a new change in the world, right? So I was inspired by Martin. I wanted to be Martin Luther King or Jesus or Gandhi, someone like that. As I was going in high school, I was kind of like, well, what am I going to do? So I really want to change the world, but people get burned out in change the world jobs, right? It's a hard task. It doesn't happen very easily. So I decided I was going to have a day job, and I was going to become a biologist. And again, part of what I wanted to do was address how we misuse, but actually I don't even know if it's a misuse, I took that out, but how we use science to justify a lot of the current status quo, or we use it as an argument for many things. It's a tool. It's something that people have created and made use of. Wonderful use. We have great things. We have projectors and computers. But it was problematic. So as an African-American woman, I wanted to be a scientist who could help take on the challenges of how we were using science. And then you go to graduate school. And you learn that in order to participate and be part of the scientific endeavor or scholarship, you have to develop a particular identity. And that identity speaks only in a monotone that would then make a point that after years of pipetting, we have discovered that the DNA, if we treat it with a proper sodium chloride concentration, will precipitate, and then we can do the sequencing that allows for us to do the Human Genome Project. And then we will define all the variations in the world, and we will be able to solve your problem. Okay? Well, it didn't work that way. Fortunately, at the same time that I was a graduate student, I became aware of Dr. Lenora Bolani, who was running as an independent for president in 1992. I worked on her presidential campaign, and Lois Holtzman. They are both developmental psychologists who have dedicated themselves to addressing the impact of poverty in the world, and they created independent institutions, starting back in the 60s, but have been around now for 30, 40 years, and it's been an organization of volunteers and various donors, primarily individuals, who have said, yes, we want to participate in creating a different kind of America in which we can, again, eradicate, eliminate, address issues that come from poverty, right? And so it's a multiracial, different backgrounds. Think of a label, everybody's there. So what I loved about that, of course, was that coming from my own background, I was looking for ways of bringing people together from different arenas. I thought it was important to mention here because that question of how do you create something around your passion? So you don't have to have my passion, you don't have to agree with me on even how to approach things. But I think the question is, as a grouping, is for this conference, is what is future career of scholarship? What do you want to create? Right? You were already saying, what do you want to create? Not what do you want to fit into, but how do you build that? And that's an organizing activity. So in addition to having to identify project management, one of the questions is how do you invite people to do things with you? We often say, well, this is what I do. Isn't that an invitation? I don't know, I have friends that's like, oh, I'm going to dinner. And I'm waiting. Was that an invitation? So fortunately, I've learned something in the last 20 plus years about organizing. And one of the things in terms of coming into academia, again, we start to develop this identity of how we're supposed to work, what institutions are supposed to look like, what scholarship citations, writing are supposed to look like. And you go, well, if I'm not that, then what? Or how do I create something else that has as much validation? And then you start looking for those same qualities, those same characteristics. Well, that's limited. What if you create a new one? Because we somehow started to think that what it meant to do scholarship or PhDs was just to be isolated and doing that transcription. I'm hoping Jessica looks up for this image. And that's not it. Like, that's an isolation. Why do we want isolation? Do we want isolation? I think the challenge of breaking from institutions, and the person who asked the question before, is you start to miss things about being affiliated with people. We're a social species. How do you create being with one another? And the thing is, so as a former born-again Christian, one of the things I believe in terms of being created in the image of God is we are creators. We create things. Again, you don't have to believe what I believe, but I think we see that part of our intellectual efforts and endeavors are this creation of things, creating with what others have said and written. That's why you want to cite them. It's a beautiful process. And the thing is that we leave our development at the age of, like, for 8-year-olds, for 5-year-olds, we don't allow, we think more of that friar. I'm wondering if the image is actually going to play. Go.
No, I didn't want that one. That's supposed to.
Well, I think maybe it's just an image. I imagine them playing, imagining them, you can see it, right? It says, hey, dude, pass me another bar. So we create this environment of play for kids, but we start going, well, if you're going to be serious about your research, no, play, right? But you're like, no, I want to play with ideas. I want to break out understandings. I want to create a new norm. How do I do that? And it's not in isolation, it's in Playville, which is what Google learned how to do. And most businesses that are actually taking off are like, let's give our employees play. They stay here and work really long hours. If we give them great food, massage part, whatever, we take care of that. And if you think about the whole Sputnik era, I have a colleague, Roscoe Giles, who I work with, he said one of the things that we did in our competition is we put lots of money into creating these giant playgrounds that anybody could come to. That anybody could come to. And if they could work on the ideas, if they could contribute to that idea, they were there. They were supported. In fact, I'm going to make the argument that our movie, the coming out, I'm calling it our movie because African American women scientists at NASA are at the fore of a movie in January. I don't care if it sounds like a promo. This is a great day for me. Awesome. So, but that got created again by having this playground for people to just come in and work on ideas because we wanted to go somewhere together. How often do we get invited to play? So, improv science, what do? We work with people to create playful environments where they can learn and stretch and do new things. These are PhDs in chemistry. We're learning how to give talks, right? And part of it is you have to learn how to engage with one another. You have to look at each other in the eye and be like, oh my God, hi. Yeah. You know, like, think about it. Like in America, this sounds weird. We're looking at each other in the eye going, hi, I'm a human being. So, how do we create, and it doesn't have to be an improv game, but you want to create this space where you're willing to be at risk with one another, to be vulnerable with what you're interested in. And the thing is that creating the change process, you want to create that rapport, that relationship, because you're going to do, again, something risky. You're going to ask people to do something different than they've ever done before. That's like, right?
Because if you asked me to give my talk in a voice like this, it would be really risky. Because it's like, what is she doing? Why is she talking like that? We don't do things that way. It's not supposed to happen that way. Right?
Lots of things aren't supposed to happen the way they happen. But the question is, what do you want to do to change things? You don't have to necessarily create a union, but if you have one, why not engage and talk about it? How do you want to create what it is that we're doing with one another? I had the pleasure of being at a conference, Performing the World, which are performance activists from around the world, including people who work in the refugee camps in Europe, with platform children in India, in Juarez, Mexico. This conversation is between Lois Holtzman, Ken Gergen from Swarthmore, who does performance psychology, and Schechner, who created performance studies at Columbia University. And in this conversation, they were saying, well, what is the relationship between performance and social change? And they're like, there's no difference. You can't take, not that there's no difference, you can't take them apart, particularly for social change. And so I think there's a challenge as academics because we want to say, well, it's an academic institution, it doesn't have to do with change. But it is a change. It's a societal construct. So we are creating a change. So that might mean you have to do a different kind of performance. And what is it to do a different performance with one another? How do we give up, in some sense, my right opinion and exactly how we should proceed to figuring out how to stand next to each other? It's a different thing, me convincing you that my idea is right and my asking you to walk somewhere with me. There's a conversation between Paulo Freire and Miles Horton, who are adult educators. The book is called We Make the Road by Walking, because you want to walk alongside in creating, and how do you listen to one another to create something. And I think what I loved about being invited to be here is this question of what can we create together? What direction do we want to go in terms of this scholarship? What conversation do you want to have that you haven't been able to have? That might seem somewhat inappropriate.
It might sound like that squeaky voice from before.
I want to leave my PhD program and still be a scholar. I wonder if it's possible to make money and not sell out. Is it okay that I think that there's, I don't know, you fill in the blank. And this is what's coming for the proposals, so I hope you will take a moment and wonder what conversation you haven't been having and that you'd like to talk with people about. You guys are a wonderful grouping, laughing, listening as an audience is like fabulous, because I think you can create something together with that. And I hope at some point you might consider next year, September, a Cultivating Ensembles conference that I've created, where we look at these kinds of questions in STEM and supporting innovation and what can we create together. And for today, what can we create together?